1917, Russia is a nation on its knees. An empire that stretches across 2 continents, holding 1/6 of the world's land, is coming apart at the seams. For 3 long years, it's been bleeding itself white in the trenches of World War I. Millions are dead, millions more are wounded, and back home in the sprawling, freezing cities like Petrograd and Moscow, there is no food. The railways, choked by the impossible logistics of war, have broken down. Women stand for hours in bread lines only to be told there's nothing left. Their kids are starving. Their husbands and sons are dying in a war that has lost all meaning. The social fabric, stretched thin by centuries of absolute rule and deep inequality, has finally torn. Back in February, the people of Petrograd had flooded the streets. Their first demands were for bread, but that quickly escalated into a full-blown rebellion against the Tsar. Then, the unthinkable happened. The soldiers, ordered to fire on the protesters, refused. They joined the revolution. With his authority shattered and his military gone, Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of a dynasty that had ruled for 300 years, was forced to abdicate. A new government rises from the ashes. The Provisional Government, a group of liberals and moderate socialists, promises a new dawn for Russia. They promise freedom, elections, and reform. But they make one fatal mistake. They promise to continue the war. And so, the suffering continues. The chaos gets worse. The nation is a powder keg, a power vacuum where a dozen different factions are screaming about what Russia should become. But in this year of turmoil, only one voice would cut through the noise. It belonged to a man who'd been in exile for over a decade, a man whose entire life had been dedicated to a single, ruthless vision. He wasn't returning to Russia to participate in its new democracy. He was returning to destroy it. This is the story of how Vladimir Lenin, through sheer force of will and strategic genius, crafted a revolutionary call to action so simple, so direct, and so powerful that it would convince a nation to overthrow its new government and change the course of the 20th century forever. To get the power of Lenin's call, you first have to understand the despair he was about to exploit. The February Revolution wasn't planned. It was a spontaneous, chaotic explosion of pure fury, born from more than a century of grievances. For generations, Russian peasants had worked under the thumb of landowners, while factory workers in the cities faced brutal conditions for pathetic pay. The failed 1905 revolution had resulted in a parliament, the Duma, but it was mostly for show, ignored by a czar who still believed he had a divine right to rule. World War I was the final straw. It started with a wave of patriotism, but the war effort quickly turned into a national disaster. Russia's industry couldn't keep up. Its infrastructure crumbled. German and Ottoman blockades choked off vital imports. The army was sent to the front without proper supplies, sometimes without even rifles. By early 1917, morale had collapsed. At home, things were just as bad. Food and fuel shortages were a constant reality. The Tsar's decision to take personal command of the army in 1915 was a catastrophe, linking him directly to every single defeat. He left the government in the hands of his German-born wife, the Tsarina Alexandra, whose friendship with the mystic Rasputin made her wildly unpopular and fueled rumors of treason in the highest levels of power. So when workers at the Putilov factory in Petrograd went on strike on February 18th, it was like a match in a room full of gunpowder. The strike spread like wildfire. On International Women's Day, thousands of women took to the streets, their calls for bread mixing with demands to end the war and the monarchy. By February 25th, pretty much every factory in the capital was shut down by the uprising. When the army mutinied and joined the protesters, the monarchy's fate was sealed. Nicholas II was out, and the Romanov dynasty was history. In its place came the Provisional Government. Made up of former Duma members, it was a government of liberals and middle-class politicians who dreamed of a Western-style democracy for Russia. They passed sweeping reforms, granting freedom of speech and assembly, releasing political prisoners, and promising to create a constitution. But this new government was born with a fatal weakness. It was unelected and had no real legitimacy with the people it claimed to represent. And it wasn't the only power in town. Right alongside it stood the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. The Soviets, which is just Russian for councils, were grassroots groups of workers, soldiers, and peasants that had popped up across the country. The Petrograd Soviet had immense influence, especially over the army, thanks to its famous Order No. 1, which basically said that military orders from the provisional government should only be followed if they didn't contradict the Soviets' orders. This created a weird situation known as dual power, where two rival governments were fighting for control. The provisional government had the official authority, but the Soviet had the loyalty of the people who had actually made the revolution happen. Here was the fundamental problem. The people who overthrew the Tsar, the workers who wanted the factories, the soldiers who wanted to end the war, and the peasants who wanted the land, saw their revolution being run by a government of the rich. A government that, to them, just looked like the old system with a new coat of paint. The provisional government's biggest mistake, the one that would ultimately kill it, was deciding to keep fighting World War I. They were bound by alliances with Britain and France and still hoped a victory would legitimize their rule. In June 1917, the Minister of War, Alexander Kerensky, launched a major offensive. It was a complete disaster. The Russian army, demoralized and falling apart, was routed. Soldiers deserted in droves. Back home, the news shattered any remaining faith in the government. The war made every other problem worse. Food shortages intensified. Inflation skyrocketed. In the countryside, peasants got tired of waiting for land reform and just started seizing estates on their own. The government, trying to protect private property, sent troops to stop them, which only made the peasants furious. The provisional government was caught in a trap of its own making. It had all the problems of the old regime, but none of the authority to fix them. Russia was a ship without a rudder, its people's revolution hijacked. They had gotten rid of the Tsar, but they still had no peace, no bread, and no land. The stage was set for someone new, someone with a much clearer, more radical, and far more ruthless solution. On the evening of April 16, 1917, a sealed train pulled into Finland Station in Petrograd. On board was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Lenin. For over a decade, he had been living in exile across Europe, a professional revolutionary and leader of the Bolsheviks, the most radical wing of Russia's Socialist Party. His return was a game-changer. The German government had actually helped him get there, hoping he'd stir up enough trouble to knock Russia out of the war. They had no idea they were unleashing a force that would redraw the map of the world. As Lenin stepped onto the platform, he was greeted by thousands of workers and soldiers. Everyone expected him to give a speech endorsing the new revolutionary democracy. Instead, he climbed onto an armored car and delivered a bombshell. He immediately tore into both the provisional government and the Soviet leaders who supported it. The revolution, he declared, was far from over. He told the crowd, "The people need peace, the people need bread, the people need land, and they give you war, hunger, no bread. We must fight for the socialist revolution, fight to the end, until the complete victory of the proletariat. Long live the worldwide socialist revolution." This was not what anyone wanted or expected to hear, including many in his own party. They were floored. Lenin's speech was a complete rejection of the way things were going. Where others saw a transition to a liberal republic, Lenin saw the perfect opportunity for a second socialist revolution. Just days later, Lenin laid out his program in a document that would become legendary, the April Theses. It was a 10-point list that laid out, with shocking clarity, a new path for the Bolsheviks and for Russia. First, the war. He called it a predatory imperialist war and blasted other socialist parties for supporting it. For Lenin, there was no compromise. The war was a product of capitalism, and the only way to end it was to overthrow capitalism itself. He demanded an immediate end to the fighting. Second, he declared no support for the provisional government. He called it a government of capitalists that was fooling the people with false promises. Russia, he argued, was moving from the first stage of the revolution, which gave power to the rich, to a second stage, which had to put power directly into the hands of the workers and poor peasants. This was a radical idea, even for Marxists, who thought a long period of capitalist development had to come first. Lenin said, "No, in Russia, the moment is now." Third, and this was the big one, he laid out the central slogan of his campaign: all power to the Soviets. He saw that the Soviets were the only real form of revolutionary government, the direct voice of worker and peasant power. While other Bolsheviks were thinking about working with the provisional government, Lenin insisted the party's only goal should be to convince the masses that the Soviets were the one true authority and then fight to win a Bolshevik majority inside them. It was a brilliant political move. He wasn't calling for the Bolsheviks to grab power themselves, not yet. He was calling for power to be transferred to the very institutions the workers and soldiers already trusted. The rest of the theses laid out a concrete program designed to appeal directly to the people the Bolsheviks needed on their side. He called for seizing all large estates and nationalizing all land, to be controlled by local peasant Soviets. This was exactly what Russia's peasants wanted to hear. He demanded that all banks be merged into a single national bank controlled by the workers. He called for workers' control over factories, and he wanted to get rid of the police, the army, and the bureaucracy, replacing them with a people's militia. The reaction to the April theses, even among Bolsheviks, was shock. His ideas were so extreme that one opponent famously called them the ravings of a madman. Many of his own comrades, like Joseph Stalin, thought Lenin was out of touch after being in exile for so long. But Lenin was relentless. In speeches, articles, and letters, he hammered his points home. He understood something his opponents didn't. The political center was collapsing. The provisional government was proving it couldn't solve any of the country's problems. The public mood was getting more radical by the day. Lenin wasn't just forcing his ideas on people, he was putting words to the deep, unformed feelings of millions. In a matter of weeks, he single-handedly rearmed the Bolshevik Party, turning it from a confused group into a disciplined revolutionary machine with a clear, compelling mission. He had set the terms of the new fight, not monarchy versus republic, but the bourgeois government versus the power of the Soviets. He had stirred up the political landscape, and now he would weaponize the people's desperation with a slogan so powerful it would become the anthem of the revolution. A revolutionary program, no matter how brilliant, is useless if you can't sell it to the masses. Lenin, the intellectual and strategist, was also a genius at political messaging. He knew that in the chaos of 1917, with a population that was mostly illiterate, complex theories didn't matter. What mattered were simple, powerful messages that spoke directly to people's gut feelings. He boiled down his entire Bolshevik program, the essence of the April theses, into a three-word slogan that anyone could understand: peace, bread, and land. This wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was a devastatingly effective political weapon. It neatly summed up the provisional government's biggest failures and the Bolsheviks' clearest promises. Each word targeted a specific problem and a specific group of people, uniting them all under one banner. First, peace. This was the most urgent demand of all. The war was the gaping wound from which Russia was bleeding out. For the soldiers in the trenches, living in hellish conditions and facing almost certain death, the promise of peace meant survival. They were sick of fighting for a government they didn't trust for goals they didn't understand. Lenin's demand for an immediate end to the war hit home not just with the soldiers, but with their families, the workers and peasants who saw their lives shattered by the conflict. It made the Bolsheviks look like the only party that actually wanted to stop the killing. Second, bread. This spoke to the starvation crisis in the cities. The broken-down transport system meant cities like Petrograd were on the edge of famine. The image of working-class women waiting all day in empty bread lines was a powerful symbol of the government's failure. The promise of bread was a promise to end hunger, a promise of a government that would feed its own people instead of a foreign war. For the city workers, whose support was essential, this was a life-or-death issue. Third, land. This was the promise to Russia's huge peasant majority, who made up over 80% of the population. For centuries, the peasants' central demand had been to get rid of the massive noble estates and divide the land among the people who actually worked it. The provisional government, full of landowners and committed to private property, had stalled and made excuses, saying they had to wait for a future assembly. Frustrated peasants started seizing land anyway. Lenin and the Bolsheviks simply said, "Good, we're with you." By promising land, they were backing the peasants' actions and winning over the largest social class in the country. Together, peace, bread, and land was the perfect revolutionary slogan. It highlighted the government's biggest failures and offered a simple, tangible solution. You didn't need to understand Marxism. You just needed to be a soldier who wanted to go home, a worker who was hungry, or a peasant who wanted to own the field you plowed. This slogan, repeated over and over in Bolshevik newspapers and by party activists in factories and army barracks, chipped away at the government's authority and built a massive base of support for the one party that seemed to get what people really wanted. We're deep in the story of 1917, but the most dramatic moments are still to come. The standoff between Lenin and the provisional government is about to explode. If you're finding this deep dive into history valuable, consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. It's the best way to make sure you don't miss the climax of the story and our future videos. Your support helps us make more content just like this. Now, let's get back to the streets of Petrograd, where the revolution is about to face its biggest tests yet. The summer of 1917 in Russia saw the provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, struggle with escalating crises. The failed June military offensive had shattered its credibility with soldiers and workers, while Lenin's promise of peace, bread, and land gained increasing support. In July, protests known as the July Days erupted in Petrograd, driven by Bolshevik slogans, but the leadership was divided. Lenin felt the timing wasn't right and avoided direct action, resulting in a government crackdown. Bolshevik leaders were arrested, and Lenin fled to Finland, leaving the party on the brink of collapse. However, in August, General Vladimir Kornilov attempted a military coup aiming to overthrow the government. In a twist of irony, Kerensky turned to the Bolsheviks for help. He released Bolshevik leaders from prison and armed their Red Guards to defend Petrograd. The coup collapsed without bloodshed, and Kornilov was arrested. The Bolsheviks emerged as the heroes, winning support and solidifying their place as the most organized force in the city. By September, the Bolsheviks had gained majorities in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets, and Lenin, now in hiding, saw an opportunity for revolution. He urged the Bolshevik Central Committee to seize power before the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets met. On October 10th, Lenin convinced the committee to approve an armed uprising, fearing that waiting would lead to disaster. With the military in disarray and the government weak, Trotsky's Military Revolutionary Committee, MRC, began to organize the takeover. On October 24th, the Bolsheviks seized key sites in Petrograd with little resistance. The Winter Palace, where the provisional government had taken refuge, was surrounded, and by the morning of October 26th, the government ministers were arrested. Kerensky fled, and Lenin declared the Workers' and Peasants' Revolution victorious. The October Revolution marked the beginning of a brutal civil war, but it was the culmination of Lenin's vision for a Bolshevik-led government. With slogans like peace, bread, and land, Lenin capitalized on the desperate conditions of soldiers, workers, and peasants. His decisive actions transformed Russia, setting the stage for the first communist state and a revolution that would define global politics for decades.